The president just announced reforms for the energy sector in Mexico to deal with both oil and gas and power, while the PAN, which is the Partido Acción Nacional, the leading opposition party, announced its version of constitutional reforms July 31st, 2013, essentially looking both to restructure or alter fundamentally the energy sector in Mexico, which is a very welcome change for foreign investment and a much needed change as well. Both proposals seem to have at heart the need to create competitive and efficient markets that provide affordable pricing in both sectors, oil and gas and in power, to ultimate consumers and industrial consumers, as Mexico is perceived to be one of the jurisdictions with higher prices in these areas. Enrique Peña Nieto has proposed reforms to Article 27 and 28 of the Mexican Constitution, seeking primarily to retain ownership still of oil and gas resources in Mexico with the Mexican nation, or the Mexican people, if you will. However, the aim is to create an impetus for private investment through profit-sharing contracts, not production-sharing contracts, which are perceived by the industry to not be the most effective way of allocating and sharing risks, and also, more importantly, booking reserves for their accounting purposes. Now, in other areas of the oil and gas sector, Enrique Peña Nieto has opened up the market more and provided a permit regime for transportation, for storage, for distribution, and for refinement of oil and gas. In terms of reaction, I think the industry is not completely on board with the proposal because it essentially doesn't fully allocate ownership to private actors, which is the ideal scenario in a competitive market. That said, I think that there is a very deep-rooted tradition in Mexico as to ownership of oil and gas. Way back in the privatization era, people lined up to sell and give jewelry and gold and cash to the Mexican government to expropriate. That is how important this industry is to Mexico. Even though Enrique Peña Nieto's proposal seems to fall short somewhat of the ideal for what would be a reform package in Mexico in the oil and gas and energy sectors, the truth is it is a huge step for the country, and at least it opens up the dialogue and the possibility of change in the sector. On the other hand, when it comes to power, Enrique Peña Nieto's proposal is much more liberalizing, and the view is more open and willing to accept private investment, primarily when it comes to generation, where we see a complete opening. The idea being there will be private generators throughout connecting into a centralized grid that will be operated by, presumably, and it's not clear from the proposal, CFE, albeit it could be an independent governmental agency. Historically, the Mexican power market has been vertically integrated, with the Federal Electricity Commission being the sole generator, sole grid operator, transmission and distribution provider for power, albeit with some exceptions. Along the way, there have been reforms to the Constitution to allow what we've come to see as the independent power producers, self-generators, self-suppliers, and small producers in Mexico. These have not, however, been sufficient to create an open and competitive power market in Mexico. In contrast, the Partido Acción Nacional's proposal of July 31st is more explicit and more encompassing of what the fundamental reforms needed in Mexico are to create competitive markets, both in the oil and gas sector and in the power sector. When it comes to exploration and production, the PAN proposal is very clear. The state will grant concessions and contracts to private investors for the exploration and production of oil and gas. In contrast, the proposal from the president only provides for profit-sharing type contracts with private actors. Now, the reason why it's important for the concession figure to exist in terms of exploration and production for oil and gas in Mexico is it grants at least a quasi-type property right, which ties into the booking of reserves, which is fundamental to the whole investment scheme in oil and gas. And although the attempt is there to try to address the concern of the booking of reserves by private investors, the proposal is not completely clear in how that's going to be done. And it delegates to secondary legislation and potentially accounting principles the manner and the scope as to which that booking can occur. And further to the point that the PAN proposal is much more explicit as to exactly what it's trying to achieve, it does create constitutional agencies or expands upon the authority of existing agencies to participate or to regulate the sectors in question. So the Comisión Nacional de Hidrocarburos, which is the National Hydrocarbon Commission, is elevated to constitutional agency treatment and authorized to grant concessions when it comes to exploration and production of oil and gas. The CRE is also elevated to a constitutional level as a constitutional agency, which has certain legal implications in Mexico, but more importantly, grants the agency the authority to grant permits and concessions in terms of other areas of the oil and gas segments: transportation, distribution, storage, refinement. Mexico is a growing economy, and therefore areas of growth will be oil and gas and power. I mean, they are fundamental to industrial processes and to that economic acceleration that Mexico is experiencing and wants to continue experiencing. It's important for the rest of the world because in addition to the investment opportunities for manufacture or for production, there are also the raw resources required, which are now going to be part of those investment opportunities. In terms of opportunities for financing, well, they abound, particularly in the project financing realm. Thinking about these particular segments, these are prime targets for financing projects. And particularly in the financing field, these reforms open up myriad opportunities for financing projects in Mexico. And it's traditionally been an area of focus: oil and gas, exploration, production, storage, transportation, refinement, and power generation. Those opportunities are, the bread and butter of a project financier, and therefore I think banks are keen to see what these reforms will produce in actuality. Now, it's somewhat premature to conclude exactly where these reforms are going. We still need lots of deliberation, discussion on the same, and at least some form of accord among the primary parties in Mexico as to what the fundamental changes to the Constitution will be. And thereafter, we'll still need to understand what implementing legislation and regulations are proposed in order to effect those changes. That said, this is a great time to be keen and observing developments in Mexico in these sectors because change will come.